it was open to the Mediterranean. You could have sailed into it. And now all of a sudden it dawns on him, Atlantis is a place that borders the Atlantic Ocean, contains the Atlas Mountains, and contained a people that Herodotus once referred to as the Atalantes. How crazy is it really to think that it might have been called Atlantis in prehistoric times? I mean, that's not a huge leap, right? So he said, oh my gosh, it's West Africa. It's been hiding in plain sight, and we've just missed it.
Hi everybody, it's time for yet another episode where we delve into the topic of lost civilizations. Welcome to the show, Jack Kelley.
Thanks for having me, others.
I am truly glad and honored to have you on the show because you had to travel to Stockholm to talk to me, not from Denmark, I assume, but still.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. It's my pleasure. So, I was totally intrigued when I learned about your coming, as we record this, it's not yet out, your coming documentary titled The Atlantis Puzzle. And in the promo material for the film, you ask the question, what if the Atlantis story we think we know is wrong? But that, of course, begs another question. What Atlantis story do we think that we know? So we'll dive into that, of course. Jack, so you're obviously a filmmaker, but tell us more about you. What's your background and how did your interest get piqued by this fascinating topic?
Yeah, it's funny, Anders, a lot of the most interesting things in life come to you completely by accident.
Synchronicities.
Well, yeah, or just a series of odd coincidences, right? This particular, I wasn't looking to do a film about Atlantis. It was the last thing on my mind. And I was on vacation on the Greek island of Santorini with my wife in 2019.
Yeah, it's a fantastic place.
Pre-pandemic, the good days.
Yeah.
And I was going to see a site called Akrotiri, which is remnants of a city that was buried by a huge volcanic eruption that destroyed what used to be called the island of Thera, which is Santorini today, around 1600 BC. So this is a true, quote-unquote, lost civilization because it just simply ceased to exist after that time. And today on the island, you can go and they've cleared out a section of the debris. And it's under, I would say, about 6-7 or more meters of volcanic ash. And they've cleared this out. It's incredible. I mean, it's I guess Bronze Age civilization, but, they had multi-story buildings with toilets, indoor plumbing. I mean, it's an incredible thing. So I was there to see that. And we're staying in the hotel. I think we're about ready to grab a taxi. And there's a bookshelf in the lobby. And, we're just kind of waiting around for a few minutes. And my wife just suddenly says, hey, take a look at this, and pulls out this book and hands it to me. And it says something like the Atlantis Conference 2008. And I said, what the heck is this? Somebody, some crazy Europeans had an academic conference about Atlantis. Like, I thought this was all just a fable or something. And
but you had heard about it.
Of course, I'd heard about it.
In the ordinary way that most people.
In the ordinary way, and I had read the Platonic dialogues before, and when I was young, and I had concluded, okay, yeah, this is just another allegory about the Atlanteans were bad, so they got punished by the gods, right? So I uncharacteristically, I hadn't brought any reading material with me on vacation. And I'm sitting by the pool, and I just, I'll read that book. So I'm thumbing through this Atlantis conference book. And most of it, I think, was silly or just not well thought through. But then I came upon 2 papers, and they're written in the style of academic papers by this Greek researcher named George Sarantitis. And I studied, classical languages, literatures, and so forth as part of this thing called the Directed Studies program at Yale back in the late 90s. before I eventually went on to a degree in architecture. And so, I knew a lot of the classical references, and I'm reading through and I say, okay, wait a minute, Plato this and historic that, okay, this, and this. I said, holy crap, this guy might actually have cracked this. And so I reached out to him and heard nothing back. Months later, the pandemic hits, and I get an email back from him. He says, hey, sorry I didn't get back to you. I had COVID. I was incredibly sick.
Okay.
And he's an older gentleman, and, he got back to me, and we had a wonderful initial conversation, because you never know when you're going to talk to somebody like this, right? I mean, the very idea of Atlantis, I think, is so frightening to mainstream academic researchers, simply for the reason that they could easily wind up looking like fools, right? There's the risk reward is not there for them, right? If I go and try and do something about this, people are going to laugh at me. What if I don't get tenure? I'm not going to get to publish my next book.
There are a few subjects like that, or topics like that.
Absolutely. This is one of them. And so I think what's so interesting is that keeps a lot of first-class minds from seriously addressing what this subject is really about. And I think Sarantitis is a first-class mind. He is a guy who was trained as an engineer. He studied ancient Greek growing up. He is Greek. And he's an extremely intelligent, capable person who his hobby was classics and Plato and philosophy. And I think for George, basically, in a nutshell, he kind of refused to believe that this was all just a nonsense fairy tale.
Yeah. What gave him that hunch?
Well, first of all, Plato is an extremely disciplined logician, right? And he's essentially the foundational figure of Western philosophy, right? Of course, there's Socrates, but Socrates never wrote anything, which is also interesting. And we'll dovetail into what we're going to talk about later. But yeah, so for those who don't know, Plato was born, I think it was around 428 BCE and lived until around, I think, 348 BCE in Athens, during what I would describe as kind of the high age of Heraclean culture. But unfortunately, it was also a period of what I've termed civil war in the documentary, but it's really a war between Athens and their allies and Sparta and their allies. And that was the Peloponnesian War. It went on for, the better part of 30 years during Plato's lifetime. And so Plato, as a thinker, was mentored by this figure known as Socrates. And a lot of Plato's books, the majority, feature Socrates as a character. And he's a sort of philosopher of the streets, always questioning people and, examining things and trying to examine wisdom and goodness and how you should live your life and stuff like that. So the fact that Plato was so concerned with, his day job is he's a philosopher teaching at the academy, which was his school, sort of the precursor of the modern university in Athens. This is his day job. He's teaching guys like Aristotle, right? I mean, what on earth would Aristotle get out of some cockamamie fairy tale about Atlanteans? So he said, there's got to be something here. And this is a key. George assumed not that Plato was acting in a silly or ridiculous fashion, but maybe that we moderns are missing something. And that, I think, is the key that opened up all of his thinking on the subject.
To give background to the stories that he wrote, or the account of Atlantis that Plato is responsible for, it's from two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, or Critias, how do you pronounce that?
Critias, yeah.
Critias, Timaeus and Critias. That's where he talks about Atlantis. And it has been interpreted in modern the modern interpretation has been that this is some kind of a cautionary tale for the youth or something like that, isn't it? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, the standard kind of academic story is, look, Plato wrote Timaeus and Critias toward the end of his life, some of the last books he wrote. Timaeus is complete. Critias kind of cuts off, after what I would say the equivalent of about 15 or 20 modern pages, mid-sentence. And so for that reason, the standard academic interpretation is that, well, he never got around to finishing it. Or option B, he wasn't satisfied with kind of where it was going. So instead he just put it down, and instead he wrote his last book, which was called The Laws. So, these were probably written ballpark around 360 BCE. Yeah. And the story, just to lay it out, Timaeus, the little bit about Atlantis only lasts like a few pages. And then we get into the main part of the dialogue, which is, and the dramatic scene is that Socrates is hanging out with three guys, Timaeus, Critias, and this other guy named Hermocrates. And they're all talking about this wonderful speech, which is not included, that Socrates, quote, gave yesterday. And they're saying, oh, that was such a great speech, Socrates. How can we possibly thank you? Well, we'll make speeches now and try to follow up and give you something, good to listen to. So uncharacteristically, Socrates sort of, he's normally agitating, right? He just sort of kind of sits there, he asks a few questions, then he just listens, right? So then Critias, the character, comes in and says, Socrates, your story reminded me of this story I heard when I was a kid. And I heard it from my grandfather, who was also named Critias. He heard it from his father, who was named Dropides, and Dropides was friends with Solon. And Solon was one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, and he had been this kind of lawgiver figure who had kind of restructured the Athenian government. I'll say around 600, 595 BCE. I'm sure somebody can correct me. I might be off by a few years, but that era. And he said, listen, he heard this story, and Solon told it to Dropides. Dropides told it to my grandpa. Grandpa told it to me when I was 10. And now, you really got me thinking that the society that you described reminded me exactly of, the ancient Athenians in this story, and they were fighting these guys called the Atlanteans. And he kind of lays out a few other things, and then he says, well, I'll tell you the rest tomorrow, or later after Timaeus finishes his speech. So Timaeus goes on, and it's a long book, and Timaeus' speech is basically kind of covers like kind of cosmology, and it's sort of how the universe began all the way down to the creation of human beings.
Yeah.
And then it kind of ends. So then the next dialogue, Critias picks up with Critias telling the story of, I'm going to tell you this story that came from Solon. Solon had gone to Egypt. He heard this story at the Temple of Sais, which is a real place in the Egyptian Nile Delta. And he was super interested in the ancient past. So he was talking with these priests there, and he kind of told them what the Greeks knew about ancient history. And so he kind of was going back as far as he could go, and invariably it sort of degenerated into myth and, going back to these kind of ancient flood events, right? Well, the Egyptian priest just kind of laughs at him and says, you Greeks are fools. You don't know anything, because basically every time there's a disaster. And
when Solon was there was like 600 BC or something?
Yeah,
so
I would say, somewhere around Plato. Between 600 and 590 BC. So this is several generations before Plato. So it's
relevant for the time framing here.
Oh yes, yeah. So we're back at least 1, 2, 3, 4 generations prior to Plato, and maybe more. And so Solon's kind of talking with these guys, and they say, well, look, every time there's some disaster, you Greeks, your society falls apart, there's a collapse, whatever it is, a dark age, you guys lose everything, including writing, and you have to kind of start over from scratch. And that's why you guys you have this childish ideas of these myths and things that happen. But we Egyptians, are a lot smarter than you because we've got everything written down here in our temples. Also, here in Egypt, the climate is very moderate, right? We have the Nile. We know it floods every year. It's very predictable. We're not typically subject to massive floods coming down from mountains. We're not subject to, massive forest fires, right? We have a stable civilization, and that's how we know this incredible story. In fact, I'm going to tell you, I'll bet you that you Greeks don't even know this. It's about your own people. And you guys are such dopes that you don't know that you don't even know where you came from. Yeah. And I'm going to tell it to you. It happened 9,000 years before when they're sitting down. So ballpark 9,600 BCE. Yeah. And this story is about a great conflict between this kind of aggressive Atlantean empire that took over all of North Africa and kind of the Western Mediterranean versus this sort of Greek kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, coalition led by the ancestors of the Athenians from 9,000 years ago. And then there was this great war, and essentially first the Atlanteans were kind of attacking and enslaving everybody, including the Egyptians, and then the Athenians kind of led the fight back, pushed back.
According to the Greek.
According to this is the story that the
Athenians,
Egyptian priest is telling.
Yeah.
Okay. So that goes all the way back, and then eventually the Athenian army defeats the Atlanteans, but they kind of drive them back to their capital city gates. But there's this horrible series of earthquakes and floods. The city's destroyed, and in the process, kind of the whole Greek army is buried by what I'll call liquefaction, right? Which happens when you have a earthquake and waterlogged soil, right? And it's sort of like quicksand. They basically get I think the phrase is swallowed by the earth. Yeah. Right. So that's essentially the tale that Critias tells. But again, as we mentioned, he's just getting into like the juicy part about the war, and then the story cuts off mid-sentence.
Okay.
So that's the dramatic background.
So the documentary is based on, as you tell us here, the findings of George Sarantitis, or Georgios Sarantitis is perhaps his Greek name.
So I've called him Yorgo.
Anyway, Sarantitis. So walk us through you said that he had cracked the code. He had cracked the code of these two dialogues, which nobody else has really. Or, he as far as I understand, he retranslated these stories, these dialogues from scratch, which probably no other academic had done for I don't know for how long.
Yeah, quite a while.
And what are the main discrepancies between what he found when he did his retranslation and what is normally interpreted from these dialogues? What were the main focal points of what he found?
So there's ironically there's two sources of misinformation about the Atlantis story, and one is kind of no offense to my friends, Hollywood stuff and entertainment, where you get all these, Aquaman and underwater fish empires with laser blasters and stuff like that. And the other source, ironically, which had people kind of chasing lost continents for centuries, is the more academic translations of the last several hundred years. And you say, how could that be? And I think this is something that's very telling about humanity in general, as an assumption was made. And if you look back at kind of any other translation, what you're going to read is that Atlantis was this continent out in the Atlantic Ocean, and when there was a disaster, the whole thing sank. Mm-hmm. That's not actually what it says. And Sarantitis, was convinced. Sarantitis had done a lot of work with Plato's use of mythology, right? Because this is a myth. It's a story. And he said he just sort of refused to believe that, you'd think, well, what's a Platonic myth versus, a fairy tale that you hear as a kid from your grandma, right? A Platonic myth, in his view, would have many of the same characteristics as Plato's other teaching or other thinking, right? It doesn't make sense that It's like a nuclear physicist suddenly, writes a story about a talking duck. You say, wait a minute, there must be something more going on here, right? This isn't
could be metaphorical or
exactly. This isn't for kids, right? Who are these books for? The books were for advanced thinkers, students in the academy, or other, well-educated people of classical Athens, right? Or the broader Greek world. So, the main thing that George realized when he was going through this, and he started reading through the different, some different translations versus the original ancient Greek, is that it said, Atlantic Ocean, blah, blah, blah. And he looked and said, wait a minute, that's not what this says. In the ancient Greek, it says, to get to Atlantis, basically from Greece, you have to cross a body of water called an Atlantic pelagos. And a pelagos, for people who don't speak Greek, is still the word used by modern Greeks to refer to seas like the Aegean or the Ionian Sea, or maybe the Adriatic.
Right, they call it pelagos, Aegean on something.
Yeah, so the Aegean pelagos, the Ionian pelagos, right? That's the word for a sea, and it's a sea partially enclosed by land and islands, right? And you have to remember, who are these people? Well, the Greeks were massive maritime traders and raiders and colonizers, right? The sea was very important to their way of life. They have a different term for the Black Sea. The Black Sea is not called the Black Pelagos. It's called the Euxinos Pontos, and loosely translated, that means something like sort of, a brackish sea, which is enclosed by land and friendly to strangers, and Xenos, right? It used to be called the Aexinos Pontos, I believe, in earlier prehistory, kind of before it was colonized. So, and then the Mediterranean, for example, is called a thalassa, which is like a large, a larger sea. Notice none of these say ocean. Okeanos was what was referred to as what the Greeks referred to as the great river or the great body of water that surrounded the known world.
Word also did exist in the language.
Yeah, Okeanos, exactly.
Yeah.
And their world was Europe, Asia, and Africa.
Yeah, but they understood that there was an Okeanos somewhere out there.
They knew, well, because surely because a lot of people say, well, they didn't, they hadn't been outside the Mediterranean stuff. It's nonsense. People knew. People knew that the world extended further.
If you look at the ancient Greek maps, for instance.
Yeah. And the Carthaginians, who were contemporary society, had sailed both.
They had contact with India. And
sailed in Northern Europe. They'd sailed down the coast of Africa. They'd been out in the Atlantic Ocean. They weren't blind, right? So anyway, that's a little bit of a background about how Sarantitis got started.
George.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit like somebody suddenly tells you Paris isn't in France, and you say, well, that's news to me.
Yeah.
What else is different? So, and he's reading high quality translations which were otherwise very good, but they had made an assumption. Why? Nobody had ever heard of an Atlantic pelagos before. Where is that? I don't know. Do you? Nobody knew. George didn't know. No one ever heard of that before. Everyone knew about the Atlantic Ocean. So basically what happened is, and it's almost unbelievable, everybody and their brother who translated this assumed Plato had been talking about the Atlantic Ocean. And that's not what it says. Period.
Fascinating. And so were there any other pivotal words that he found were wrongly translated before?
Yeah, exactly. So, my early career was on Wall Street. And one of the things that in structured finance and after I got out of college, and one of the things there that I learned was meticulous attention to detail. Sarantitis' education, as when he was young, was as an engineer. So he was also meticulous about logic and fact-checking. So he said, one of the things I remember is if you went into your boss's office with, some printout of numbers and, you know, our legal document. And he said, here, if he found one mistake, he immediately would stop reading and say, you go back and check this and come back when it's all right. Because that one mistake, the rest of it could have been correct, casts doubt on the rest of the work.
Yeah, it does.
So this is exactly what Sarantitis was. He said, this is a key distinction. This is a huge mistake. What other things might be wrong? And he found a few other things which hadn't been perfectly delineated. Furthermore, Plato, a lot of people forget how complex the grammar of ancient languages is. And I studied Latin when I was in, you know, high school and college, and ancient Greek, I think, is of a similar, if not more, you know, greater degree of complexity. Certainly more complex the grammar is than most modern languages, of which I'm aware. And so there are a lot of really subtle nuances when you're dealing with a writer of Plato's caliber. So the fact is, you can read a really good translation, but you're still going to be a little removed from some of these assumptions. And if the translator is not careful enough, some of these things may be missed. And another example is, well, everyone sort of said, well, you know, it was this continent in the Atlantic Ocean, and there was an earthquake and a flood and it sank. But there's sort of three words for island that get kind of thrown around in the story. One is an island continent. Another is sort of this kind of pointy island that's in the center of the continent, which is a bit odd. So it must be a body of water or some water around that thing. And then within that, there's this, what I think most people think of, this ringed capital city of the Atlanteans.
We'll get back to
that. So essentially what George realized was, this doesn't say that there was a continent that sank. This says that there was an island, the city island got flooded. Well, all of a sudden you go from the realm of impossibility because
a continent island
sinking. There's no
a city sinking.
There's no continent island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
But it says somewhere. It says somewhere. I mean, I have to admit that I haven't read these dialogues firsthand. But doesn't it say that it was as big as Libya and Asia together or something like that?
The continent
and Libya was the name for Africa at the time.
So this is another great nuance, Anders, because that phrase, Libya and Asia, this is the continent was as long as Libya and Asia in length. And which definition of Asia and which definition of Libya?
Yeah, that's...
I'll tell you. Because that phrase is almost exactly word for word in a Greek author named Herodotus, who was known as the father of history, who wrote a generation before Plato. So everybody knew his book. It wasn't like today where there's millions of books. There were like hundreds of books, you know? And so you could read all these books. So this was the first major history book. Everybody would have read it. And that's the same phrase Herodotus
so everybody
uses.
Assumed that Plato was referring to what Herodotus meant when he spoke about it.
On the contrary, I think everyone missed it.
Okay.
But people from ancient time who read a history book might have picked up on this. That's the definition. That's how he defines the length of Europe. He said Europe is the same length as Libya and Asia put together. And what was his definition of Asia and what was his definition of Libya? Well, together, they can't be longer than Europe. And Europe, in his definition, starts out at Spain and Portugal, and it goes to, I think, like the Caspian Sea or whatever.
Caspian Sea, yeah.
That in that range. I can't remember exactly.
That makes, then he probably refers to Asia Minor plus Northern Africa. That would...
Ballpark, yeah.
Ballpark. I mean, that's about the same length as Spain to the Caspian Sea.
Yeah, something like that, exactly. So what I think George picked up on this, I don't know of anybody else who ever did. I've read Herodotus in multiple translations. I read it in college. I studied it in college. I've read it personally on different translations. I never picked up on that. I missed that. George picked up on it. And he said, wait a minute, where have I heard that before? And what you have to remember is, again, think about today when the news comes out. It's all about the context of modernity, right? I mean, if I say, hey, what are the borders of France? Or on the French border, XYZ happened. Well, am I talking about the French? Everyone knows I'm talking about the French border today. I'm not talking about the French border in 1942. I'm not talking about the French border in 1547. I'm not talking about the French border in 943. Right? I'm talking about today. And so, back in those days, the context would have been, what was the knowledge of the Greek world that people had, and what were the other books that were sort of, what were the major books or major influences of the time, right? So, and we'll get into this a little later, but if I tell you a story about a bunch of bad guys who enslaved everybody and came out of the middle of the European continent, and they were fought back by heroic people from outside, I'm making some type of analogy to World War II, right? It's the same exact. Everyone's going to pick up on that. Same thing in Plato's own era. You have to remember, when he's writing this story, there are a lot of things buried in there that deal with the context of people would have known in his own time. Certainly the educated people.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating with this. A key point in trying to locate where Atlantis was is geography, of course, and we have already touched on it here. Another central or pivotal concept is the pillars of Herakles, or the pillars of Hercules, as they are also called, I believe. So most people have assumed that those refer to, when he writes about the pillars of Herakles, he refers to the Strait of Gibraltar. But as far as I understand, George Sarantitis here, he believes that they're actually in Africa, in West Africa. Or where are they? Explain.
So this is another crazy...
Because I just have to say that for the listeners, that it says in the dialogues here that Atlantis was located outside or in front of the pillars of Hercules, wasn't it?
So basically, you had to go through the pillars of Herakles.
Yeah.
Then you would cross the Atlantic Pelagos by ship, right?
Okay.
You sail through these, sail by or through these pillars. Yeah. You sail across this Atlantic Pelagos, and then you kind of go down through these bodies of water and islands, and then you can kind of get to the center of the Atlantean continent.
Yeah, well, you can understand why people have believed that. Many people still believe that. I mean, of course, it refers to the Strait of Gibraltar, and then you have the Atlantic, and then you sail a bit further, then you come to this place.
Yeah,
right.
So this was another reason why I dismissed this when I first read it many years ago as just sort of, it's a fairy tale, because there is no lost continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, right? We know with modern plate tectonics, right? Yeah, there's the Central Atlantic Ridge and there's some islands and stuff, but not what we're talking about here. And the other key piece was, Plato says that at that time, in other words, the time of the Atlantis story, 9600 BC, the Atlantic Pelagos was navigable. But today, it is silted up. When's the last time the Atlantic Ocean silted up, Anders? I'll tell you, never. The last time that...
Well, that's a matter of definition. I mean, go back millions of years, probably.
Billions of years, right? So, but if you go back, actually, so the Mediterranean did close up, but it was about 5 million years ago.
Yeah.
So that's certainly before, humanity as we know it. So what's so fascinating here is with the pillars, this is another place, this is actually a place in the film where I feel we could have done a better job, because, and this is going to sound crazy, but because the pillars of Herakles, most people by the era of Herodotus did think the pillars were somewhere in the region of Gibraltar, right?
Because you have two rocks there, you have two mountains that look like a little bit like pillars on either side of the strait.
Which is one assumption. But here's the great thing, and we talk about in the film how Sarantitis kind of realized that Plato was talking about something in North Africa. But the amazing thing is that while many of these authors kind of all agreed that it was somewhere near the Strait of Gibraltar or Spain or that area, they didn't agree among themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little bit like if you sort of were to say, well, where's Stockholm? And somebody says, oh, it's at the southern tip of Sweden, and somebody else says, well, it's on the eastern coast of Sweden, and somebody else says, well, actually, it's out on an island, and somebody else says, well, actually, it's not really the larger city; it's really the old city. That's what we're talking about. These guys nobody could agree.
They're all right in their own ways,
right? But if you think about that, what does that mean? If everybody is saying it's something different. Some people thought they were actual physical pillars, like of a temple. Other people thought they were natural rock formations, like the Rock of Gibraltar. And, and other people thought that they were, who knows, islands actually was another one. If everybody thinks it's something different and they're all like, but yeah, it's probably all in the same area. What's that tell you? I'll tell you. Nobody has a damn idea what they're talking about. It's a fact, right?
Point there.
If I say, well, where's your lung located? And you're like, one guy says it's up here, another guy says it's down here, another guy says it's here, whatever. Well, none of them actually know. And Plato loves stuff like this, right? And even within Herodotus, and this is where I think we could have clarified better. There are parts of Herodotus where he does speak about the pillars as if that they're kind of out near the Strait of Gibraltar. But there's a specific section there where there's this voyage of a Samian ship that was headed from the island of Samos and in the Aegean down to the Egyptian Nile Delta. And George knew this story, and George was a sailor, and he was very familiar with boats and sailing and the Aegean and knew these currents in the Mediterranean. And it says these guys got blown off course, and they wound up landing in Libya in a place near what's called modern-day Bamba. It's a sort of promontory on the Libyan coast. Well, they took a couple of days, and they tried to sail back to get to the delta. But this huge storm blew them off course to the west, and they got blown all the way through the Pillars of Herakles to a place called Tartessus. Mm-hmm. The Tartessus
it's Tartus today.
Well, in modern, I don't know what it was called in a modern version, but a lot of people today think this was somewhere in southern Spain for obvious reasons, right? And
what could it be then?
However, the fact was also, like the Pillars of Herakles, if you go back and read ancient sources, nobody exactly agreed on where or what. Nobody knew exactly where it was. Yeah. And so this doesn't mean that it didn't ever exist. But what this means is, first of all, look at that distance. Do you know the average length of a storm on the Mediterranean, like a really bad one? It's like max, like 4 days, 5 days, something like that. You don't have a 20-day storm that just doesn't stop blowing, and a ship in Herodotus's era couldn't travel particularly fast, especially a trade ship, not a warship, right? It's a fatter, shorter kind of hull and so forth. Well, George did some math and realized that there's just no way that you sail, you're headed due west. You have to sail all the way north around the Horn of Tunisia, past Sicily, all the way down the African coast without hitting Spain, without making landfall, to blow through the Strait of Gibraltar. That's an improbable journey for guys who are professional sailors.
Yeah, if you're just blowing with the wind, so that would be pretty impossible.
It doesn't make any sense.
No.
So what that tells you right there is, even within Herodotus, there's some doubts about where this is. And for people who are kind of like, hey, when are you guys going to get to the cool stuff? I think the setup of the geography and the story, this is why it's called the Atlantis puzzle and not the Atlantis adventure, because it's really a detective.
Or the Atlantis answer.
Yeah, it's a detective story where, you have to piece together these things to have any idea of what it was. Otherwise, you're just making something up.
But
right?
what is George's best guess then?
Yeah, so George's guess is essentially based on the Gulf of Gabes, which is in modern-day Tunisia.
Tunisia, Libya border
Yeah, Tunisia, because it's due west from where these guys would have taken off in Libya.
Yes,
and it would have only taken maybe 5 or 6 days to get there. And if you're headed due west, you can't miss it. So here's the thing. If that's where the pillars of Herakles were, or a set of pillars of Herakles, right? Because there's another meaning to the word Plato uses, and I can read a little ancient Greek. The word he uses is stelae, which is, we would say a stela, which is a commemorative plaque that the Greeks used to leave when they'd kind of reached some far bound of exploration. So these were kind of, they also used to put up trophies when they won like a victory in a battle. This is what they were about, right? They sort of stake the flag, put the plaque there. So the
pillars could actually be stelae.
That's the word Plato uses, and that has a dual meaning.
Okay.
It can mean a physical column, but of what building? Or the other meaning is this commemorative stone plaque that, you see when you go to the park, so-and-so, Bjorn Bjornsson did something great here, And so if you really think about what that means, it's fascinating because it also starts to explain why there could be multiple locations of the pillars of Herakles, because there are later authors. I think Tacitus talks about pillars of Herakles that are up in northern Germany. There are pillars of Herakles that are described to be to the east of Greece, kind of in Asia Minor. Why were there more than one? Well, if these represent the limits of the current known exploration by Greeks, they're clearly going to continue to move. It's like the western border of the United States. It was someplace very different in 1799 versus 1865 versus today, right? And that moved within a couple hundred years over a vast distance. So it's the same exact thing, right? Think about it. As the Greeks start doing more and more exploring and they're seafaring and their society is building and they're doing more trade, the pillars change locations. Another location was between Sicily and Italy. That was another location ascribed to the pillars. What is this telling us? Well, it's an evolving knowledge of geography. So anyway, why George placed these in Tunisia.
Is there anything physical, anything geographical, anything concrete today in Tunisia that would imply that
100%. And
they might have been there?
So remember we talked about the Atlantic Pelagos, this big inland sea.
Inland sea.
That in Plato's era had sort of dried up and was no longer really truly navigable by big ships, but had been navigable in 9,600 BC. That such a place exists in modern Tunisia and Algeria. Today, there's these series of salt lakes called shots.
Yeah, I know about those. I've been to Tunisia. I know there's a salt lake or several.
Many of
in
them.
The south of Tunisia.
Which are quite large. And anybody can see that there used to be a bigger body of water there, right? Because in the dry season, they kind of dry up. And you'll see these photos. If you Google it, you'll see ships or even like kind of rowboats just kind of beached, like sitting. But you can see the lake bed extends out for, tens of kilometers. Those salt lakes used to be connected.
I see.
And if you go back 11,600 years ago to the era, the 9600 BCE, there was an enormous, what's called a paleo lake there. And it was called the Shots Mega Lake. There's your Atlantic Pelagos.
So there's evidence or indications that there was a Pelagos, but there is no evidence for pillars, the two pillars?
Nobody has ever found a physical plaque or a column or anything that looks like pillars there. So, but again,
doesn't mean that there haven't been.
Well, and that was the thing. Where are those pillars in Strait of Gibraltar? Where are those plaques in between Sicily and Italy? They're gone. Either they never were there, or they were there and somebody just looted or destroyed them. Not like that's uncommon with stuff from the ancient world, right?
Yeah.
So George, so basically, boom, all of a sudden George has a real massive sea that really existed, and also the whole climate. Many people might not know this. The whole climate of northern Africa
It was rainy back then, yeah.
was green. It's called the Green Sahara.
Yeah.
Non-controversial.
They know about this today, and it's. I mean, there's an inertia in the school system, but people who are looking into this, they know.
Yeah, and you know, when I set out to make this film, the Atlantis puzzle, I went and fact-checked a lot of Sarantitis' assumptions because I don't want to look like a dope, you know. And I've probably read 50 to 75 scientific papers just about the Green Sahara and mega lakes of northern Africa.
Yeah.
It's real. They were definitely there. The climate was completely different. By the way, as the Sahara dried up, so it was wet from, call it, I don't know, 10,000 BCE, all the way down to maybe, in different places, it's
5,000 BCE, I think.
Maybe around 4,000 BCE. And that is why a lot of people attribute the beginnings of pharaonic culture in the Nile Valley. People were running out of water. Everybody was coming together around the Nile. Yeah. And you had this formation of this mega state for those days, right? So anyway, Sarantitis now has his smoking gun. There was a sea there. It was open to the Mediterranean. You could have sailed into it. And now all of a sudden it dawns on him, Atlantis is a place that borders the Atlantic Ocean, contains the Atlas Mountains, and contained a people that Herodotus once referred to as the Atalantes. How crazy is it really to think that it might have been called Atlantis in prehistoric times? I mean, that's not a huge leap, right? So he said, oh my gosh, it's West Africa. It's been hiding in plain sight, and we've just missed it.
Right. Okay. So west of the Atlantic Pelagos was the land mass of West Africa, and that's where Atlantis was, according to George's theory here. So, and we know now that, I mean, you were pointing out that the Sahara was green back then at this time, and we know now that Sahara is also replete with cave paintings. But are there actually any, or is there any archaeological evidence for an advanced seafaring civilization in that area of the world?
So this is now where we start to get into a little bit of the realm of uncertainty, right? Yeah. Because the fact of the matter is that once you go back to the sort of what we'll call the Stone Age loosely, even though some people were using metals as far back as maybe at least 8,500 BCE, but in small quantities, as far as we know, right? Once you kind of go back that far, the evidence really falls off, right? So, and it's a bit like anything. You go to the library and you can find tons of books written in the last 20 years. How many books do they have from 200 years ago? How many books do they have from 400 years ago? How many from 600? And think about that same thing as far as, you know, physical sites and evidence. Also, a lot of places that have civilization have also been built over or recycled.
Yeah.
So that is to say that the oldest, so fact is, the oldest physical boat that exists in the world is from the Netherlands, and it's called the Pessa canoe. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And it's about 10,000 years old. So, but here's the thing, it was dug up by accident in a peat bog by some guys constructing a highway.
Yeah.
Right? If it hadn't been stuck in that peat bog,
are good at preserving stuff.
No one ever would have found it.
No.
And the same thing has happened in Central Africa, in Nigeria. So there's this guy out digging a well, and he's about 5 meters down in, I think, the 1980s, and he suddenly hits some kind of wooden structure. And so he goes to his, local tribal chieftain and says, hey, something's down there. I don't know what it is. And they wind up excavating 5 meters below the surface under all this clay soil. There's a 9-meter long canoe. Preserved.
Pretty big for a canoe.
Pretty big for a canoe. And the thing is, so they dig this up, and it's called the Dufuna canoe. And it's the earliest boat of any sort that has been physically found in Africa to date. But here's the thing you got to remember. Without that clay and without that random guy digging a well, we never would have found it. Right? These things are not found typically by archaeological teams going out and looking for them. They're found by accident in random places that you couldn't possibly know there was anything there. Well, that begs the question, how much other stuff is out there, A? And B, humans are a pretty adaptive species. If I see that you have a cool watch, I want a cool watch, right? And if I see you have a car, I want a car, right? That's the reason we're not all riding horses today. People wanted cars, right? or buses or airplanes. And the fact is, if you think about people's survival, well, if you have a canoe, why wouldn't I have a canoe? Why wouldn't we make more canoes? Because we're in the same tribe. Our survival depends on, fishing or whatever it is. We're going to share this technology. So I think the lesson here is, just because we don't have a ton of wooden ships in museums from 10,000 years ago doesn't mean they weren't there. Because why? They're made out of wood, and wood rots and deteriorates. Wood doesn't typically last in nature more than 1,000 years.
No. And metal also disintegrates.
Metal also disintegrates very, very quickly. I mean,
more quickly than people realize, actually.
100%. Look you see cars with rust on them from 10 years ago.
So, I mean, if they used metal, if there were humans in advanced civilizations living on Earth 10,000, 20,000 years ago, and they used metal, we wouldn't know today. Or, I mean, that metal would have either been reused, which it probably would have, but it would have corroded or disintegrated in other ways.
This is a total sidebar, because Plato, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds, but, Plato does describe, the civilization he describes sounds a lot like a Bronze Age civilization, which has led a lot of people to assume that, well, that's really, he was talking about some Bronze Age civilization, and it's sort of, we got the dates wrong, or the manuscript's been corrupted, or so forth. But the fact is, if you look at the West Africa of this time, there's one, there's a thing that's been going around on the internet now for about 5 or 6 years about the Richat structure, which is this place in Western Africa. But I think a lot of people are like, oh, that's Atlantis, case closed. But the thing you got to remember is that's a bit like somebody in a calculus exam looking out of the corner of their eye at somebody else's paper and said, oh, he said the answer is 5. It's 5. They didn't understand it. They didn't do the work. So the idea is that in the center of this kind of semicircle continent, you have this sort of pointy island, which is today what George describes as the Adrar Plateau, which is a rhombus-shaped island with a point to it, pretty similar. And furthermore, it has this concentric ringed structure, which is unique on our planet. And the size is approximately as Plato described it. The thing you have to remember, though, is you have to ask, with this civilization, and the thing where I was going with that is there's been a lot of stone tools found in and around the Richat. So if we're, again, what this says is the evidence we have is there is a physical place that matches very closely the descriptions Plato had. The waterways were seemingly connected. There were these mega lakes. You could have probably gotten down to that region from the Mediterranean.
But not from the Atlantic, or? I mean, some people even think that there might have been a waterway from the Atlantic up to that structure. It's very high up today. So I think it's 1,300 meters up above the sea level today, but it might have been lower then, and the sea might have been a little bit higher. And
the sea was lower during the early Holocene. The sea levels have increased since the end of the last ice age.
That's right.
And
that's right.
The continent
was locked in the ice cap.
Yeah, and Africa hasn't moved vertically too much. But that's the thing of the people who are like, oh, maybe it was all It was lower and there was water and stuff, but it wasn't. The sea levels were lower.
Far back in time, so it wouldn't have happened that much.
No. So, but again, we have the translation. There's nothing to do with the Atlantic Ocean. So what Plato says is, okay, first you pass this Atlantic Pelagos, then you sail down through these islands through an Atlantic Pontos, which means it's got to be a body of water similar to the Black Sea.
Okay.
And then you go on to a second Atlantic Pelagos, and then that connects to the ringed capital city via a waterway, right? Now, again, we got to remember, are we proving that this existed, or are we merely saying that the setting of the story was a physical place? A bit like Shakespeare sets Hamlet in Denmark. Denmark's a real place. I've been there. And Hamlet was a historical figure. But does that mean that Shakespeare's story is exactly 100% true?
No.
And that's where I was kind of getting at with the stone tools. We don't see any metal tools.
But we wouldn't, because they would have corroded, so as we just mentioned.
Probably.
It just shows that people have been living in that area. Maybe later, after.
From the late Pleistocene and the early Holocene, there's evidence that people were there. So people were definitely there. The climate was wet. There are freshwater fossils. It would have been like this fisherman's paradise. It would have been a perfect place for kind of hunter-gatherer fishing type people to live, right? So people were definitely living there, as is true with most places in Africa. People have been living there for a long time.
Yeah.
They came and went over tens of thousands of years with the cycle of these green Sahara periods, which is almost hard to imagine, right? But every 20,000 years, the Sahara goes from desert to green to desert to green. Yeah. And it's been doing this, as far as we know, probably, at least for several 100,000 years, probably for as much as 8 million years. So basically, as long as there's been mammal, like primate type creatures, the green Sahara has been around. And what we know for a fact is that there were people living in North Africa at this time, where as the desert expanded, they retreated to areas where there was water.
Yeah.
But then when it became green again,
they
expanded again.
Went back.
Yeah,
north,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, it might have to do with the Milankovitch cycles, the inclination of the axis of the Earth, because when it changes, then also the intertropical convergence zone moves.
That's 100% right.
Upwards and downwards. So, I mean, it's logical.
Most people don't know about the Milankovitch cycles.
No, I do. I'm strange. So, but what does George have any theories as to how this civilization, I mean, we can discuss how advanced it was, but let's say it was a fairly advanced Bronze Age civilization. I mean, being able to build a capital city like that. How did it collapse? Was there a cataclysm? Does he have any hypotheses around that? Because, many people delving into this topic, they talk about the Younger Dryas. There's an impact hypothesis, for instance, and there's Robert Schoch's ideas about the sun
solar outbursts,
and maybe a combination of the two.
Sure.
So, because we know that the Younger Dryas period occurred just about the time when this Atlantis would have existed, according to Plato's account there, 9,600 BC, or that's where this Younger Dryas period ended.
Yeah.
And it lasted for about 1,300 years or something like that. So, and we know that the climate was first very much colder and then very much warmer than, or I don't know if it was the other way around, but there were huge, large shifts in the climate within pretty close range of time there. So what's his idea? What's his theory about this? How did it end? What happened? Why did it collapse?
Right. So there's a couple things I want to be careful about. One is George makes no claim that the society described in Timaeus and Critias actually existed.
Okay.
He says, however, his point is, look, the geography is real. Mm-hmm. The climate matched. The physical structures are here. It's real. That's real, right? So the setting specifically had reality.
Yeah.
We know that people were living there. We don't know, right? The metallurgy thing doesn't seem to line up. So one of the things we do in the middle sort of second act of the Atlantis puzzle is we spend a lot of time going through the true and false of all reading between the lines of what's the myth say? Like you pointed out, Bronze Age civilization, that means they've got metal. So far, the oldest mines for mining metals in Mauritania that are known are from like 1400 BC. Doesn't mean there couldn't be older mines. It means there's no evidence of them, right? So I think that one of the mistakes I think people see, they're a lot of people are very excited about this film and they're thinking, my God, it's real. We've been vindicated. It's here. And it's all true. Yeah. But then you got to ask yourself, Plato wasn't a historian. He wasn't an archaeologist. He was a philosopher.
Yeah, but he was all of the above also. I mean, back then they were, as we were talking about before,
a Renaissance
man.
Well, pre-Renaissance.
Pre-Renaissance man.
Right, but his day job, he's a philosopher. Right? He's not a historian, right? Herodotus is a historian. Xenophon could make a claim to being a historian, right? Thucydides was a historian, versus Plato and Aristotle were philosophers, and so were a lot of other guys, Herakles and Democritus and the Elean school and all these guys, Pythagoras. But remember, our author is a crafty guy who's probably, no offense to you and me, we're smart guys, smarter than we are, and even smarter than George.
Yeah, I would concur.
The guy is a genius, one of the top geniuses that humanity has ever produced. If that's the case, we got to be careful that we are not reading a too surfacey version of the story. We have to assume he's smarter and there's more here. He's not saying this happened, because why would he just write this crazy story again? Why? Why put this down? For what's the benefit for his audience? What's the benefit for himself? Is this just a really cool ancient story he heard about that he's like, I got to write this one down? But then why is it structured the way it is? Why do you get this little preview, like a trailer almost, in Timaeus, and then you get this weird cut-off dialogue in Critias? It doesn't make any damn sense. I think we have to assume that we're dealing with a high-grade thinker, because this is true of his other books, right? His other books all have allegorical stories. They have layers of meaning. They have historical allusions. There's allusions to actual figures who are sort of portrayed in slightly different ways than maybe they actually were, and then why, right? And so, again, the study of philosophy, which I had the good fortune to get exposed to for a couple of years, when I was in college, and by the way, I missed an enormous amount. I went back and read half of Plato's books in preparation for making this film. I missed so much when I was 18, 19, 20. I mean, it's almost, you feel like people should, I don't know if we should be reading that stuff until our brains have developed a little more. We have a little more life experience. But, so anyway, getting back to George, let's talk about West Africa. Well, so the climate matches up. There were other megalakes there. There was something called the Anet Moyer megalake, which kind of roughly corresponds maybe to this Atlantic Pontos, right? And then we have this civilization. Well, this city is like nothing you've ever seen. This ringed city with these massive buildings. There's horse racing tracks. There's canals. There's harbors. There's walls that are tens of kilometers long, clad in tin and orichalcum and copper. Orichalcum means kind of something like mountain copper. It's like it's a bit
alloy.
A bit bronzish alloy, yeah. And there's this massive temple of Poseidon in the center of the city, and there are these palaces, and the empire is ruled by 10 kings descended from Poseidon, who is the god of the sea. So where is all this stuff, right? Well, one of the things I did in the film is I said, well, look, let's test George's hypothesis. Let's say Not that this society was actually real, but that there were people living here and there was a disaster that gave rise to this myth. Let's just make the most basic assumption and test that, right? Mm-hmm. So even if we're talking about Stone Age people can still have, cities and mud huts and stone buildings and stuff like that. And they've
cities, but
they've found settlements even in Europe dating back like 23,000 years, and they're not extensive.
Well, we are assuming that they only use stone tools, but we don't know.
Nobody knows for sure. Nobody knows for sure. Again, we have to look at what's the evidence that we, I like to say there's what's possible, there's what's probable, and there's what's provable. So we can say, yeah, it's possible these guys have metal, but is it probable? And is it provable? It is certainly not. So but is it possible someone had metal in 9600 BCE? Yes, because people had it in 8500 BCE, and it's not that far off, right? So what do we have here? Where's the city today? What could have happened? What kind of disaster could have actually struck this ringed capital city? And you have to remember that the Richat sits surrounded almost kind of on three sides by the Adrar Plateau, and it's lower in elevation. So all the runoff and water from this huge plateau is going to kind of come down into this almost like a bowl. And it's very similar to, I lived in South Korea for a year when I was 23. Don't ask me what I was doing.
You make me curious.
And it was in a city called Daegu, which is sort of in the southern kind of hinterland. Daegu is surrounded on like 3 or 4 sides, by mountains also. There's a huge drainage problem in Daegu, as you get all this runoff, and it kind of not congeals, but kind of conforms into this into the low-lying areas, right? Water seeks a lower level. That's what happens. So if you go back to a green Sahara period, and like you said with the Milankovitch cycles, not only was the African monsoon moving northward, but the Mediterranean monsoon was moving southward. There's some evidence about this as well. So what's that mean? Well, we're talking about potential flooding annually on a massive scale. Where's the evidence for this? Well, about 12 years ago in Nigeria, there was a really bad monsoon season, and 2 million people were made homeless by flooding. 2 million people. I mean, so
there's a lot of people in Nigeria.
There's a lot of people in Nigeria.
But
still, that's a huge amount of damage. I mean, something like 600,000 homes or something were just destroyed.
Yeah.
So if you go back to what we know about 9600 BCE and we say, okay, well, could have been some stone buildings, could have been some mud or adobe style buildings with wood and, leaves and straw roofs and stuff. I mean, there's still straw roofs in Denmark and stuff, maybe here in Sweden. So, you have to imagine what those buildings, from what we know in the archaeological record, would have looked like. Now imagine that a mud, adobe hut gets hit by a flood. It's gone, man. It's gone. So whoever was living there, if there was a massive flood, earthquake, and a kind of tsunami, because again, there's quite large rings of water around here. So if there's an earthquake, earthquakes typically create tsunamis. And in a lake, I think it's sometimes called a sage or something like that, but let's call it a tsunami. You're talking about, and if there's a massive monsoon season, the water's all running down from the surrounding plateau, an earthquake hits, and it creates a tsunami. First of all, the earthquake's going to wreck all the buildings, and you're going to have this huge kind of tidal wave type thing flowing through. Anybody living there, I mean, it's just going to be wrecked. I mean, we're not talking about we're not talking about the Pyramid of Giza or modern skyscrapers that are built to solid, heavy to withstand forces like this. We're talking about adobe and stone huts and stuff like this. So I went to Oregon State University in the United States and spoke with Dr. Scott Ashford, who is kind of preeminent earthquake expert. And at Oregon State University, OSU, they've got this massive building the size of a warehouse that has a what they call a tsunami wave basin, where they use to reproduce different types of tsunami waves, and then they'll like build little models and things, and they'll measure the effects.
Yeah.
So I went there and saw this machine in action, and you almost feel like you're like on the beach in Thailand in whenever it was 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, that wave's coming toward you, and it hits hard. So we talked about, well, what are the possibilities, and how do these different natural disasters interact, and does Plato's description of these, is he just making this up, or is this real? And from everything Dr. Ashford said, Plato is accurately describing what the effects of the combination of these natural disasters would have been, right? So, so the possibility exists, let's say, at its most literal, that there could have been a civilization there, again, probably more hunter-gatherer style, 9600 BC, probably using stone tools, but the massive buildings and temples and stuff covered with gold and all this, that might have been some more kind of allegory. Like Plato has the myth of the metals in the Republic, right? So there may be some symbolic meaning in there. But the fact of the matter is, as far as we know, there were not, 200-meter temples with gold ceilings and stuff like that, right? There's no evidence of any of that. As you point out, even if there had been something there, a bunch of metals, well, usually people either, can corrode and rust and go away. Or in the case of gold, people don't leave gold sitting around for 10,000 years. If it's there, they find it and they take it.
Yeah.
And a great example of metal recycling in the historical period is the Colossus of Rhodes, the largest statue of the ancient world, made out of metal, standing on the island of Rhodes. I think it was, I don't know exactly how high, but, I think it was at least 120 feet, which is like, 40 meters, something like that.
Yeah.
That statue was toppled in an earthquake, and it sat there for like 800 or 900 years. Eventually, I think it's during the early Ottoman Empire, some Jewish merchant from Edessa came and bought it and transported it away, cut up, and taken away on 900 camels. So and today there's nothing left. There's just maybe a foundation where there's some stone. Yeah. So even one of the greatest features of the ancient world could disappear in a couple thousand years. So whatever was there is long gone, right? We're probably not going to find evidence of what was there.
This is so fascinating. We could talk for hours. I know we can talk a little bit more if you have time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. So I just want to ask about this. I mean, the Richat structure is a key. What's the word? Candidate for being the capital of this supposed Atlantean civilization. But the fact that Plato talks about 10 kings in this empire. Could it be that the Richat structure would be the remnants of one of the capitals, and that this empire would have been much, much larger perhaps, and there were other similar looking capitals in other places? I mean, about all these theories that this was there was an island in the middle of the Atlantic around the Azores. Randall Carlson and many others talk about this, and you also know that, for instance, Graham Hancock and others talk about the what you find on the seafloor in the Bahamas, the Bimini Road.
Sure.
There's a sunken city outside of Cuba, and there are other stuff, and many think then that independent researchers that this could be parts of a more like global civilization or global empire that had many, sections, and that this could be one of them. So what are your thoughts when you hear about these theories? When you hear Randall and Graham, for instance, talking about their theories about where this took place? Well, before and after you met George, perhaps.
Yeah, I think before I met George, I thought, that's some pretty interesting stuff. And now I think, hey, Randall, you don't speak ancient Greek. Like, you don't know actually what the book says. Yeah. George does. I read a little bit of ancient Greek and can write a little bit. I've fact checked a lot of George's stuff, he's right. The word okeanos doesn't appear once in those dialogues. Pelagos and Pontos do. And so what we're talking about is the geography of George is purely fact based on the original documents. And that's why that's why I thought this story was worth telling, is for the first time, we've really blown open the door we've cut through kind of all the theorizing to say, well, what's it actually say?
Yeah.
And so I think there's no doubt that Carlson and Graham Hancock and so forth are right insofar as surely there were other civilizations existing that were in lands that are today below water. No question. The continental shelves of North America, there's massive areas, right? Here in Europe, Doggerland is a real, quote unquote, sunken continent, even though it's not really a continent. It's part of Northern Europe. Yeah. It once extended all the way from Denmark, all the way across the UK and Ireland, all the way down to northern France.
And you have Sunderland, and you have
Sunderland and Sahul.
Outside of India as well.
Yeah, like Southeast Asia, if you go back 15,000 years, was mostly above water. Yeah. And same thing, Papua New Guinea, the land between there and Australia, was above water, right? So, and we know people were living there, right? Yeah. Why wouldn't they have been living there, right? If you're living right next door, I mean, it just stands to reason. And and people say, well, but I think a lot has been made about this whole end of the Ice Age cataclysm. And look, I've been to the La Brea tar pits, and I used to live in Los Angeles, and you can see, wow, there's a lot of bones there, like something bad happened here. You can see in several places in the United States where there's that line marking the kind of end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene. Yeah, it's pretty thin in most places. I'd say a centimeter.
I think you
can
find it on three continents or something like that.
Yeah, I'm not too up to date on where you can see it.
Evidence of huge wildfires.
Yes.
Raging for tens or hundreds of years, perhaps.
Yeah, and I mean, so clearly there were massive disasters, and what's so fascinating is that is contained in the Atlantis story, right? The Egyptian priest says, you Greeks are always losing your culture anytime a disaster happens.
And every time, I mean, that's indicates that it's happened before.
And Anders,
even before this.
It did happen, and I can tell you exactly when. One time, the first time. Remember the Iliad and the Odyssey, right?
Yeah.
Bronze Age civilization, Mycenaean civilization. We're talking 1600 BC, maybe 1800, 1600 BC, all the way down to around the 12th century BC. Those are the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's where, I don't know if you've ever been to Mycenae and the Peloponnesus.
No, I haven't. No.
It's a remarkable...
I've been to Santorini, though, to Akrotiri.
Yeah, remarkable place. So the Mycenaeans were sort of the kingdoms that controlled Greece. All the way, kind of, let's just say up to about the 12th century BC. And then there was some sort of, right shortly after the events of the Iliad, there was this kind of collapse of Bronze Age Mycenaean civilization. They had writing. Let's go, Linear B, which is still, I forget if it's Linear A or Linear B, hasn't completely been deciphered, but they had a writing system, right? And which some of what they believe was inherited from the Minoans, who were around from 3000 to at least 1500 BC on the island of Crete. And I've been down there to Knossos and so forth and seen this stuff firsthand. So here we are, 12th century. These guys have writing. It's a high age, massive, castles and fortresses and cities and so forth. Huge megalithic stone construction. These guys clearly had a civilization going, right? They're trading all over to Egypt and so forth by sea. What happens? They have a downfall. Do you know this? That the Greeks were illiterate for 300 to 400 years until writing was reinvented around 750 BC.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and that's where the current Greek alphabet came from. It came from Phoenician. And the Phoenicians were these people from the Levant who had colonized Carthage and given rise to the Carthaginian Empire, which is in the Western Mediterranean and was at a kind of a peak around Plato's era. So the modern Greek alphabet owes its origin. Writing had to be reinvented. There was a dark age. They had lost.
Yeah.
They had lost
But
their
I was
past.
thinking of maybe this happening even before now 9600 BC, if you see what I mean.
Sure.
That would be even more mesmerizing, of course.
Well,
If it happened 20,000 BC, 50,000
sure.
BC.
And the question is, how far back can we know that? Well, we know that this happened at least once, right?
At least once, yeah.
Roman Empire rose and fell, right?
Yeah, it's a case in point. I mean, so it shows that it can happen.
It happens again and again and again, and eventually the nations of the modern world will, have risen and will fall. I mean, people are fighting today, unfortunately.
I think it's a thin veneer or civilization, thinner than we believe.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to speak about the, lost civilizations in general, not just the one we call Atlantis. I mean, we can call it anything, but this is a story, and your film is focused, of course, on Plato's account and what George has found when he has retranslated these dialogues.
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, I have a soft spot for these, theories about lost civilizations in general, and it might have been other civilizations. And so, I mean, regardless of what we call it, it's the core issue is lost civilization in general. So we have, of course, the flood story in Genesis, which is the most known one to Westerners at least.
Yeah.
And there are flood stories, flood myths in hundreds of other ancient traditions around the world, and this has been proven. We have the Vedic texts, we have the Sumerian tablets, we have the Mayan texts and accounts, we have the Egyptian King's List, which is supposedly, I think, goes back 36,000 years or something like that. And we have Egyptian description of Zep Tepi, the first time, which is also very legendary, very, very ancient time,
Sure.
And so why would these legends, these texts, these traditions be baseless myths if we now agree that Plato's account wasn't? And this is not to mention, of course, the smoking guns, if you will, as we just used that term before, of the many mysteriously advanced megalithic structures in Peru and Egypt and other places. And I mean, you might be one of those who actually leans towards the theory that this was actually built when textbooks say it was built. But have you been to Peru?
I have.
Been to Cusco?
Yes.
And you've seen these layers of extremely advanced at the bottom, and then you have kind of not so advanced rubble-like structures in the middle, and then you have the Spanish stuff on top.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really make sense. I mean, if you read the textbooks, they say, "Oh, that's Royal Inca or Imperial Inca, and this is Standard Inca." I mean, why would they build why wouldn't they finish the building in one style first and then build other buildings it's just there's mishmash.
a lot of open questions.
Of course.
And one of the things
that's what makes life interesting.
Well, even there's, I can't speak to all of these, but there's, even if you just look at there's a couple things I'd like to go to kind of here at the end, and I'd like to talk a little bit about esoteric writing, and I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the hidden meanings that are in this story. But just to wrap up on the scientific front in terms of stuff, I am certain that more and more stuff is going to be uncovered in the next 100 years about stuff, because we're learning so much all the time, right? And a perfect example of this is in North America, which where I'm from. There was this hypothesis for a long time that the first people who ever were there were the Clovis people. And they came there in, 12, 13,000 BC-ish, maybe around the end of the Ice Age, and that was that. This became the established orthodoxy. But they just recently found fossilized footprints in my home state of New Mexico, home state these days, in white sands, which buried by sand that are 23,000 years old, and they've been dated about 8 different ways by U.S. government geologists. It's not by fringe people. It's unequivocal. We were off, or when I say we, modernity, modern science was off by 10,000 years, right? I mean, if we go out on the street and I say, "Oh, hey, Anders, how old is that tower in Stockholm?" And you're like, "Oh, well, that's about 200 years old," and then it turns out that it's actually like 8,000 years old. I'd say, "Jesus, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about." Well, these scientists do know what they're talking about, but again, it comes down to the evidence, and there's. With every, are you familiar with Thomas Kuhn's, I think it's a structure of scientific revolutions?
Paradigm shifts.
Yeah. You have a body of knowledge which makes sense. The Clovis hypothesis made sense. There was a lot of evidence supporting the Clovis hypothesis. Here and there around the edges, there were a few things that didn't quite fit. And people said, well, the data must be corrupted. Or, that guy did
eventually we'll find out why it looks like that.
Bad work or whatever. And but here's the thing. If you went against the Clovis paradigm, you were a fool. You were a charlatan. You were a dope, right? You were not a serious academic researcher. Well, guess what? All those guys were wrong. And this is a key that I think is buried, one of the many layers, because I think there's about 47 different layers in Plato's story. I think the Timaeus and Critias are an unacknowledged, unrecognized masterpiece of philosophical thinking that we have neglected and forgotten for what it really is. We recognize things Plato wrote, like the Republic, as masterpieces. This is a masterpiece of esoteric philosophy because of the hidden layers of meaning within it that's been lost. And it just like the thing, the parallel I'm trying to draw here is you have a theory that makes sense on the surface for a long time. Atlantic pelagos, he must have been talking about the Atlantic Ocean. That's the paradigm. Anything to suggest anything other than that sounds crazy. This guy must be bats, right? He's nuts. But the fact is, in North America, this Clovis hypothesis is wrong because we have concrete evidence that the facts don't line up with the theory.
It's a good example. You have also Göbekli Tepe in Turkey.
Sure.
Which also upended much of our.
Well, that was the idea that people couldn't build stuff. Well, there you have it, right? So that idea that people couldn't be building stuff because they were hunter-gatherers is wrong. And just the same here, George has upended this idea that there was some fantasy continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, so forth. That's not what the book actually says. So I think that, in a similar way, to me, this is a thunderbolt that opens this up. So I started digging into this because when Sarantitis, by the way, has written a book, which is not widely available. You have to probably contact him directly to get a copy, and it's called Plato's Atlantis. And I've read it. It's about 400 pages long, and it's written like an academic textbook. I mean, it's an in-depth parsing of the Timaeus and the Critias and a retranslation. It's incredible. So, but, when I first read that, I thought that Sarantitis was a little overreaching with some of his ideas. I thought, I'm not sure if all his interpretations, because he had a couple things where he said, well, I think Plato was indicating or pointing to this or that with this line. And I thought, maybe he was. And then I went back and reread all this stuff. I thought, my God.
Made sense.
He's right. There's no question. Yeah. Remember the line I told you from Herodotus? That's almost exactly the line, the length of Libya and Asia together. That doesn't occur anywhere else. It's in Herodotus. That's clearly where it came from, right? So these references, there's one particular reference which we kind of end the film with, which I'm not going to give away, but so there's a wonderful book by a professor named, retired professor now named Arthur Meltzer in the United States. I think he was a professor in Michigan, maybe Michigan State University of political science and philosophy. And Meltzer has his book is called Philosophy Between the Lines. It's a wonderful, brilliant thorough explanation of esoteric philosophy. And as a person who's a seeker, anybody should be interested in this, because basically up until a couple hundred years ago, around the time of the Enlightenment, every philosopher recognized, understood, and wrote esoterically. What's that mean? Esoteric means inner or internal. Exoteric means outer or sort of the surface layer. So in other words, all these philosophers through history not only wrote this way themselves on multiple levels, they recognized that style in earlier thinkers. I'd have to give this in a super nutshell version, and people I would encourage to go out and buy this book because it's genius. And it explains that basically with the Enlightenment...
What's the name of it again?
Philosophy Between the Lines by Arthur Meltzer. Basically, with the Enlightenment, we have this idea that philosophers can change society and we can make it into a place that's safe for society. And today in the modern West, we've largely succeeded, right? Free thinking, freedom of speech, right? The right to, wear certain color clothes. I mean, some of those things were outlawed 500 years ago, right? We take that for granted. We have forgotten what the world was like. And if you go back to Plato's era, everyone likes to think of Athens as this very tolerant, liberal place where everybody was could say whatever they want. Wrong.
For a chosen few.
Socrates was put to death for being a philosopher.
Yeah.
His ideas, were they even that radical? And yet a man was executed for being a quote unquote free thinker. Now just think about all the horrible stuff that happened with Christianity during like the Inquisition and the Dark Ages and stuff. I don't even want to go there. If you were a thinker and you recognized that a lot of this stuff was nonsense or didn't paint a full picture or wasn't scientifically valid or logical, and you tried to explain stuff, you brought up Galileo. Galileo could have been executed. He had to retract his position.
He almost was, yeah.
He had to retract his position. Yes. This is the world we forget that these guys were living in, right? So that's why somebody would write esoterically, right? They would hide meanings. And I'm gonna give a few examples, and I encourage everybody who's listening to this to go out, reread these documents. The Sarantitis translation is more specific and correct with regard to the geography and some of the grammar. But 90% of the translations, they're similar because they're not dealing with those elements. Go back and reread these books, and now start thinking about the context of Plato's lifetime. Look at the Peloponnesian War. Look at the phases of the Peloponnesian War. Look at the Persian War. Go back and look at the Carthaginian Empire, a North African empire that swept across North Africa and controlled the Western Mediterranean. Does this sound like Atlantis to you? It's exactly the same words, right? Go back and look at the historical parallels from his own era. And then I would encourage anybody who reads Arthur Meltzer's Philosophy Between the Lines to go back and read these stories yet again. There is a super deep layer here. Remember, there's not just one civilization that gets lost in this story. There are two. The ancient Athenians are also lost.
Yeah.
And what is the ancient Athenian society? What parallels does that have?
That's a mystery in itself.
What meaning does that have, right? Critias says at the beginning that the story Socrates told about this ideal society should be assumed to be the same as the Athenian society of 9600 BC. That society that Socrates describes is extremely similar to the society he creates in the Republic. The classic reading, now I'm going to get a little far out here, Anders. The classic meaning of the Republic, the reading, is that this is a utopian society. This is the first vision of a perfect state. But if you go back and read that book, which I encourage everyone to do, you're going to find some extremely disturbing aspects to this society. You can go and find them for yourselves. The destruction of the family, the expulsion of everyone over 10 years old to start the society off, a noble lie, a fake story about their origin in order to bring and unify everybody together politically. There's a lot of stuff in there. And then furthermore, everybody has a job according to their station. There's a caste system. Well, if everybody has a job according to their nature, whose nature is it to have to clean out the sewers, right? No, everybody wants the good jobs. They want to be like the general or the the philosopher king. Nobody wants to clean the sewer. Whose job is that going to be, right? And what if there's not a perfect match? So anyway, I'm going back there. I'm opening huge cans here for people to go and dive into, because if you stop and think about this, the Republic is a philosophically constructed society. It didn't exist. That means the Athenian society is a philosophically constructed society. What is the Atlantean society? They're descended from Poseidon, who's a god. And do you know why they became corrupt? Because over time, their percentage of god DNA basically was diluted with the more human element. And Plato says this at the end of Critias, or he says, the character says, important distinction. The character says, well, as they lost their godly aspect, they became more and more corrupt. Even though they had wealth and gifts and were blessed, they became thirsty for injustice and for empire, for conquering other people, right? So if you go all the way back, this is a people who are not as good or as highly developed or as noble as their ancestors, one of whom was a god. Think about that for a second. Why is that important?
Ties in with what's said in the Sumerian tablets and the Vedic texts and stuff like
any traditional society says this. Now, I'm not going the direction I think a lot of people are going to go, where they're like, oh, it was aliens and they came down and they were having sex with human women and that's why we're all here today. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, why is every traditional society set up where it devolves into myth and it has an origin of a higher, a more golden age? I'm going to tell you right now, Anders, the mistake is thinking that is literally true. Why is that myth set up? Who set that myth up? Why did they set it up? Think about it. Here's why. Here's one reason why. Why should you and I, as people of a traditional society, follow the laws, the customs, and the religion that were laid down by people hundreds or thousands of years ago, unless they were better than we were? Better than we are, wiser than we are, stronger, closer to the gods, demigods, gods themselves. Think about that. In the last 200 years, we've done away with this, right? We've gone beyond that. We say, oh, we question everything. What's new is good. But in traditional society, new was not good. Why was Socrates, what charges was he brought up on? Impiety, which means basically not behaving in accordance with the traditional religion. Think about that for a second. So you have two types of society, the philosophically constructed, battling the perfect model of the traditional society. And this is something I hope to explore more, as well as exploring future civilizations more.
Philosophy
absolutely.
in general. And
totally. But and lost civilizations too, because I absolutely agree with you. We are going to uncover more stuff. There were civilizations that existed. We just don't have names for them. We don't know what languages they spoke. Clearly, there were kingdoms, there were tribes, even empires that existed that have no names today. We don't know much about them.
And we should explore the continental shelves, seafloor, much more than we do. It's expensive, but it has to be done.
There's stuff out there. So both from a thought perspective and from a factual, civilizational perspective, there is so much, and I hope we touch the tip of the iceberg here. I hope people will go out and read as much as they can and
We
explore as
encourage
much as they
everybody to
can.
read all the books that Jack is talking about, and
Yeah, so again,
and look into this matter.
yeah, so again, if this is a more philosophical angle than people were maybe expecting, don't worry. There's plenty of action in the film and exploration, but
Jack, this is how mesmerizing this all is. You were mentioning that this film of yours is coming out. I mean, as we record this, it's still not out, and it's coming out late summer or what?
Yeah, so in the U.S. will be out late summer, probably late August, and then I would expect the international release dates will kind of follow after that in the fall, kind of
September,
country by country.
Yeah,
and you get it on Amazon Prime and Prime Video and other streaming platforms.
And where
like
can people
Tubi.
go to get more information about that and about you and your other work?
Absolutely. So we'll get you the release date so you can have update that in the show notes.
Links in the description box, everybody, of course, as usual.
And if you go to atlantispuzzle.com, we'll have all the updates and links, and anything you could want to know will be up there in due course. So
thank you so much for being a guest on the show, and good luck with your amazing project now, Jack.
Super. Thank you so much for having me on here and letting me ramble a little bit about the Atlantis puzzle.
My pleasure. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and don't forget to hit that like button and share the video with your friends. Please support the channel if you can. I appreciate all the support. You can become a Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal if you wish. All the links are in the description box below. Thank you.